Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Tribunate interview. I'm on today with Dr. Curtis Dozier of Vassar College, who is the author most recently of The White Pedestal: How White Nationalists Use Ancient Greece and Rome to Justify Hate. It's a fascinating book that I feel like is incredibly topical and incredibly relevant. So, Dr. Dozier, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And kind of to what I had said earlier in the introduction is that I read a lot of books, about Greece, about Rome, about the classical world, and they're fascinating work being done by a lot of really intelligent people that I feel like is moving the field forward, almost like on a daily basis, to where it's hard to keep up. But this is the first one I read in a very long time that I felt like, wow, this is an actually urgent book. This is something that there is a direct takeaway about how you live your life moving forward, as opposed to, looking at how is Septimius Severus minting coins or something like that, which can be interesting, but what's the takeaway, right? So your recent book, it really does a great job of detailing the uses and abuses of history by white nationalists and other far-right actors. So can you let us know how you became interested in this phenomenon and what made you decide to tackle it head on?
Yeah, I mean, there's a longer and a shorter version of that story. I wrote my dissertation in graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, on Latin poetry and ancient audiences for Latin poetry, which for me as a student of Latin poetry was an urgent question. But as you say, wouldn't necessarily intersect with current affairs the way what I'm doing now does. And so, thinking back, that's now 18 years ago when I finished my PhD, it would have been hard for me to imagine that I would have written a book like this. But a big part of the journey was teaching at a school, Vassar, where we make what scholars call the reception of classical antiquity a centerpiece of our curriculum. I think all students of ancient Greece and Rome have been interested in the ways that ancient Greece and Rome are used in later periods, and especially in their own time. I think that's one thing students and I myself found exciting about studying Latin, about studying Greek, studying ancient history, is you notice these resonances with the contemporary world. But I got to Vassar, and my colleagues here, this was sort of already in process before I got here. My colleagues had decided let's actually give students credit for making those connections. Let's create a class that's about that, and let's actually make one of our learning objectives be that students will be able to, in relatively sophisticated ways, make connections between the contemporary and the ancient world. And I think we're actually kind of an innovator in that, in actually having it sort of formally in the curriculum, this thing that I think was happening in many classrooms all the time, but we made it formally part of the curriculum. And so from the beginning of my professional career, I was teaching in a curriculum that was inviting us to make connections of the sort that I'm making in this book, and in particular to make critical connections. And so I'd been working on Latin poetry, and one aspect of my work on the audiences of Latin poetry was the rhetorical training that Romans received. And so I was interested in quintillion and classical rhetorical theory, and basically ancient theories for making arguments. And I actually did some teaching, and still, when I can, teach a course on presidential politics and classical rhetoric, where we see, if we read Quintilian, if we read Aristotle, what do we notice about the way our contemporary politicians are trying to persuade us to vote for them, and so on. And I think just coming up in my career in that curriculum, thinking about how were arguments made in antiquity was sort of a small leap to then how are arguments made using antiquity to make arguments. And so then when, 10 years later, classical scholars were calling attention to the ways that white nationalist activists, this is in like the 2010s, and in the run-up to the first election of President Trump, the way that white nationalist activists were making extensive use of the ancient world, I think I was sort of in a place where I was, there's a lot to say about that moment. We're talking about 2015, 2016
Yeah, for
in
sure.
there. I think I was surprised. I think as a white American, I didn't know that white nationalist activism was alive and well in this country. And so I was kind of shocked by it. But I think because I've been teaching this curriculum, I also was able to say, in a way that maybe I'm not sort of proud of now, but able to say, since this activism didn't affect me, I wasn't the target of this activism. I think I was also able to say, oh, this is an interesting example
Right.
of the reception of Greco-Roman antiquity. Maybe I should look into this. And at that time, I was, I had some space in my life to look for a new project. And I don't want to say I was completely apolitical. I found myself opposed to the way Trump was, campaigning and his xenophobic and kind of nationalist, nativist rhetoric on the campaign trail. I was opposed to that, but I don't think I understood it urgently then. I think many white Americans did not understand it urgently then. But those things sort of came together for me to say I should start studying the appropriations of ancient Greece and Rome by hate groups. And so I launched in 2017 a website called Pharos, Doing Justice to the Classics. You can find it online still at doingjusticetotheclassics.org, where I started documenting examples of white nationalist classicism and misogynist and homophobic classicism. And I think at that point, I still was in the mindset that my job as a scholar was to show how these hateful actors were abusing or misrepresenting or inventing and the past, misappropriating or misusing history to support their hateful ideology. And I thought my job was, to tell the truth about history. And I did that for a while. And I think a lot of classical scholars thought that. But the more I worked on it, and now we're coming around to where the book comes from, the more I worked on this material, the more I realized that although there are a lot of appropriations of Greco-Roman antiquity by white nationalist activists that are almost laughably distorted or superficial or, laughably misrepresent the ancient world or the ancient sources, that there's actually a subset of white nationalist activists who actually know a ton about history. And in some respects, see the ancient world, I've come to believe, with clearer eyes certainly than I did in my training, certainly than I think many people in the general population who think of the Greco-Roman world as a world of enlightened philosophy and high-minded political ideas. And I think these white nationalist activists in some cases see the ancient world with even clearer eyes than many professional scholars, because they recognize that the ancient sources and also the social and political practices of the ancient world contain a lot of ideas that are either adjacent to or in some cases identical to the ideas that white nationalist activists believe should be governing our society today. And so I wrote the book to invite readers to go on that journey with me, to start with the provocation, this sort of off-the-wall niche idea. Look at these apparently fringe political actors who are using the ancient world to support their hateful ideology. Isn't that a strange phenomenon? And to invite readers to go on a journey with me, the journey I went on, to realize that, as I sometimes joke, the one-sentence thesis of the book is these people are smarter than you think. And the sophistication and depth with which they use the ancient world, I think, is a provocation to us to really consider our own orientation to history and our own orientation to the kind of political ideas that underpin white nationalist thinking.
I think that's truly what makes this book unique, is that I think it's too easy for folks, on the left or in the center or even on some, gradually, unfortunately, shrinking portions of the right to say, oh, no, they're misinterpreting it, they're doing grab bag, and they're just kind of curating examples that don't really exist in context, when in reality, the past was populated by people that were not always great. And so, you can find examples of either racism or misogyny or things that we would modern day frown on, but being said through the authority of somebody like Aristotle, Plato, or Cicero. And I think a reverence that our society has for these classical figures that is oftentimes uncritical can say, oh, well, he was right. Like, one of the things I thought about when I read your book is, before I had ever read Plato, I remember talking to a cousin of mine. She was in college, and she was, I think, in her freshman or sophomore year. She was starting out, and she said, oh, we're reading Plato's Republic, and, I'm writing an essay kind of critiquing how he sets up the ideal state. And this is way before I had ever read Plato, but my initial reaction was, oh, well, that sounds almost impossible. What
are you gonna
right,
what are you gonna say that's
right.
smarter than Plato?
Right. I had no idea, clearly no idea what Plato actually said, but I was familiar enough with him to know he was authoritative. And so that was kind of like the ambient noise I had grown up in. So I didn't think, how is a college freshman or a college sophomore going to challenge like the founder of the West, so to speak? And then later you read Plato, it's like, actually, no, these guardians, they don't seem like that doesn't seem like the ideal way. I wouldn't do it that way. But I think that's a good, like, I didn't have any ill intent, so to speak, but I was just kind of blind as to what the classics actually were before I, started my education in that field, before I entered college and everything. So, how, in your opinion, though, like, do the figures that you quoted, do they distort or oversimplify the past? Because I think we can get into kind of like a look at how the fact that some of these people do have that grounded understanding that you're talking about, but just at the macro level, from 5,000 feet, was the ancient past, were the Greek and Roman society more diverse than people tend to imagine?
So you used a word that I think is a good description of how the people I write about use the past. I don't really like the word to distort. I think it's a curated version of the past, which was a term you used a minute ago. A lot of these sources do curate a version of Greco-Roman antiquity that supports and gives prestige to and their political ideas. That's the basic rhetorical move that the people I write about are making, is they look at someone like Plato and they say that he says, because Plato says that if any deformed, quote unquote, children are born in our ideal state, they should be taken away to a dark place and never seen again. Because Plato says that, Plato's a very smart guy, we should take it seriously and we should do that in our present time. And that's, it's almost laughable, the logical fallacy of, because a smart person said it, that means it must be true. But as you say, that is the normal way that ancient thinkers, the wisdom of the ancients is a phrase that's sometimes in the air. That's the normal way that these ancient thinkers are viewed. And you can read, there's a great article by a colleague, Debbie Sneed, about infanticide in antiquity that sort of shows that although these literary sources talk about infanticide, there's not a ton of evidence for it. And it turns out the ancients loved their children too, So, there's a kind of curation there, looking at these writers like Plato, like Seneca, like some of the accounts of ancient Sparta that seem to endorse infanticide. There's a curation of those sources to support eugenic measures. And you can multiply that on this point of diversity to all the ideas that white nationalists say, that there were all kinds of people, all kinds of political orientations in antiquity. There were people from all over the Mediterranean world. It wasn't a racially pure world, even if we did want to import modern racist pseudoscientific ideas about race into the ancient world. There was much more diversity, yes, than these people believe, but they've curated a version. But the move I want to make is, I can also kind of pick up on something you said where you said something like the ancient world was populated by people who weren't great. Well, I don't think if pressed you would agree on that. I think it's better to say that the surviving sources from the ancient world were written by people who were invested in maintaining hegemonic power in their societies, and they were going to make any argument to maintain that. And all the other perspectives in the ancient world, the people who resisted those regimes, who criticized those regimes, who maybe didn't take any active resistance to it, but in their hearts thought that these were violent and oppressive political structures, all of that has been erased, partly by the randomness of what survives from antiquity, but partly, I think, because of the investment of later generations in sources that would ratify and kind of justify hierarchical societies, fear of outsiders, relegation of women to second-class status, any of these oppressive ideas. So Plato's a great example, right? Why did you think Plato was so smart, right? You hadn't made a study of it? Like, what's the process by which you learned that Plato was so smart somehow? And I think it's because I think the reason Plato is viewed as so smart is because he is so congenial an author to hegemonic power throughout European history. And so looking at the ancient world, who are we going to hold up as a great thinker to justify, anti-democratic, monarchical, authoritarian, hierarchical, xenophobic ways of being? Plato is very suitable for that. And so Plato gets celebrated as an important thinker of Western civilization, or whatever you want to say, and somehow that idea reaches it to us even before we make a formal study of Plato.
Right.
And it's sort of like it's kind of like the cultural propagates the political. So when people ask me, are they distorting the ancient world? I say, no, it's more a curation. But the thing we have to remember is that the act of curation that the white nationalist activists are engaging in is the totally normal way to curate the ancient world. The traditional and mainstream way of understanding the ancient world is to think only about the politically central, elite male points of view and the sources that support those.
I completely agree, and I think that kind of facile interpretation, which unfortunately can be propagated by people who, mean well, who are not attempting to advance narratives of like hate or discrimination, but just kind of there's a tendency to take these sources at their word, so to speak, or to view them in isolation. Granted, it is certainly fading now, but the classical scholarship up until maybe a generation or two ago was populated almost exclusively by like upper crust white males who were, ideologically inclined to have those predispositions.
Right.
And so obviously, and then you look at the translations that are utilized by some of the folks that you talk about in your book, and the scholars that they quote are almost always like these folks who, oh, wow, like, he's an Oxford educated guy who became a colonial administrator in India. I wonder what his, convictions are, right? So in your opinion, how can people who are in the classical field now, or people who are interested in the classics, kind of break out of that, without throwing away Gibbon, so to speak? And I think obviously there's enormous flaws with his work, but I think it's also worth engaging in part just to see the flaws, right? So without throwing away kind of like everybody who was writing before 20 or 30 years ago, how do people, engage with the classics lovingly but also critically, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, the hostile interpretation of my book would be this guy's trying to cancel classics and what a hypocrite. He's a classical scholar who, thinks that the ancient world is bad and shouldn't be studied or something. And I hope I don't say that in the book. And in fact, I'm not even really trying to call out anybody in the field of classics or in the general population for being a white nationalist, so much as say, if you just do the normal thing with Greco-Roman history, you are in danger of either engaging in a kind of form of white nationalist activism, or at the very least, like perpetuating the idealization of the ancient world that feeds this white nationalist activism. And so, yeah, I mean, on some level, the response to what we need to do when we're engaging with history is a kind of banal one, which is be more critical, right? Read Gibbon for the flaws as much as for what you can learn from Gibbon. But I think we can expand that a little more. And I think most professional historians treat being critical as an important part of their job, and we try to teach our students to do that and everything. I do think the bar is higher in the case of Greco-Roman antiquity because the discipline exists because of the special prestige that has been given to that period of history. You can see it right in the name, classics, right, or classical studies, right? It's the only discipline that has a name that announces the importance of its of its material compared to other disciplines that have descriptive names. So the bar, I think, is higher. I think we actually have to be maybe more critical. We have to be more self-conscious, more self-aware of the potential political the definite historical political entanglements and the potential political entanglements of, continuing to engage in a assumption that this discipline exists because the material has a special value. It does have a special value, but historically that special value has been to hegemonic power and oppressive and violent politics. And so we need to be extra careful, I think, of perpetuating that in our classes. And we also have to become aware, and I speak to this a little bit in the book, of the ways that we have been taught that and acculturated to accept that in our training as historians. So this is a little insidery, but I think it's true for anyone who's a history buff or interested in the classical world. Like, really think about, like, why do you have this special interest in the classical world? Is it because you think it is foundational to modernity in some beneficial way? Is it because you think it is influential in some way that can only be described as enriching the things that came after it? Those are completely normal things to believe about the ancient world, and they are attitudes or orientations to the ancient world that neo-fascists thrive on because of the presence of so many fascist ideas in ancient texts. So thinking about Gibbon, the kind of orientation to classical history that interests me more is to recognize, yes, Greco-Roman antiquity has been very influential. Yes, Greco-Roman antiquity has been foundational to modernity. But to take that as showing that modernity doesn't have to be the way it is. That modernity, that we arrived at this political moment, whether you're talking about 2022 when I started working on this book or 2026 when you and I are talking, we arrived at this political moment not in an inevitable way, but because of a construction of history that gave legitimacy to certain ideas and excluded legitimacy from other ideas. And the world doesn't have to be this way. Neville Morley is a great historian in Britain. He has this idea that classics matters because it has mattered. And I think that, that really appeals to me, that if you look at the world now and you don't like what you see, classics was integral to the creation of the modern order, but it also shows us that the modern order didn't have to be that way, because the modern order had to be created. And so I think there's a way in which studying Greco-Roman antiquity, studying Gibbon, the first volume of Gibbon came out the year of the American Revolution. The last volume of Gibbon came out the year of the French Revolution. You'll see scholars trying to make all these arguments that Gibbon wasn't really thinking about contemporary politics, but it's pretty obvious.
I mean, yeah,
when you look at...
he was a member of parliament. We have like his actual political speeches and stuff. Like we can tell what's top of mind. And the idea that you could be like, okay, I'm putting on my historian hat and obtaining the perfect objective view from nowhere as I sit here in my country estate being tended to by various servants, and then that's a totally different person from the politician and the. So, yeah, I think that's true. I really appreciate the way that you phrased that, because I think, back to the point about curation, I think when you talk about classics matters because it matters, we're talking about an incredibly broad scope of time here, as well as, multiple geographies and different polities that come and go within this grand envelope of, the classics, so to speak. And so obviously the ones that get elevated are the ones that, the ruling structures find more amenable, right? Because I think you'd be hard pressed to find a positive history of the Gracchi brothers, for example. And obviously enormous flaws in like some of their, I'm not going to say they were, great warriors for the proletariat or whatever. Like there were still areas where they were not ideally suited for the modern world. I'm kind of struggling to eloquently say what I want to here, but they weren't perfect, but you would find a different standard applied to them than you would a politician more intent on, keeping the status quo. And so that curate, like the classics isn't even the classics. The classics is just a narrow subset. Part of why you talked about why Plato becomes more widely read than other philosophers, perhaps, or other thinkers, is because he is amenable. And so, I think that's a wonderful point, that the classics isn't always the classics.
And so this, what, just thinking of also what we do as in our orientation to history, one thing I hope, or a hope for my book, is that it sort of shows the stakes of a more inclusive vision of the past. I think there's too many people including instructors, who have the idea like, okay, we'll teach Roman history and we'll talk about women and slaves as a kind of side element to these, or we'll talk about the experience of the Roman provinces as a kind of accent to our main narrative of Roman history. And I will admit, it's hard to design a semester. I've engaged in that myself. But I think the white nationalist appropriations of Greco-Roman antiquity really should prompt us to say, those talking about the marginalized voices from antiquity is not just a DEI move or move of political correctness or whatever, although those are perfectly good reasons to do it.
Right.
But they actually are integral to dislodging a certain vision of ancient of Greco-Roman antiquity that has terrible political consequences to keep it central. And so, encountering for ourselves and helping our students encounter a diversity of voices, of a diversity of perspectives, a diversity of experiences in the ancient world, including those that rejected or chafed under or were, experienced violence from the dominant classes. That's part of the work of decentering the narratives of Greco-Roman antiquity that have been in the center too long.
Yeah, and I think, just to kind of talk about one of my favorite examples of that in classical sources, is we mentioned that we're often missing the voice from the vast majority of the population, be it women, be it people who were not in the upper 5% of the wealth distribution. But there's the famous defense of slavery as natural from Aristotle, and it begins kind of with this thing where he says, well, there are some who say that slavery is not appropriate, and then he launches into his defense, and it's like, there, that's our window, I feel like, into, you don't defend an idea that's not under attack, right? And he even concedes as he begins the speech that, there are some who say, and it's like, well, how many would say? And it's just an interesting thing to kind of think about, and to be like, well, I wish we had that. And and we get, and by the way, I mean, you really see how extensive the erasure is, because that's about it. Right. For our reference to the idea that there was any kind of abolitionist or critical movement around enslavement in antiquity, was this section of Aristotle where he seems to say he's arguing against someone. That's how erased that point of view is. And yet you look at the slave revolts in the Roman period, right, and people did not like being enslaved, and in this, in the whole population, at least a certain number of people had to have noticed that and had thoughts about it, but you would never know from the ancient sources. So as we talk about like ancient sources and how they interface with the modern world, and I think it is good and appropriate to criticize people like Aristotle who defend slavery, and criticize anyone else who is advancing notions of like saying gender equality is wrong. But what do you say to the folks who are like, oh, you're applying quote unquote modern standards, or this isn't fair to read someone from the past through through modern quote notions of morality?
Mm-hmm. That's a tricky question for antiquity
I agree.
because the views of the marginalized are so absent from our sources. So, for example, for the United States, you can look at the framers of the Constitution, who many of whom were slavers and enslavers, and you can say, well, you're judging them by modern standards. But in fact, there was an abolitionist movement in North America longer than there's been a country, the United States. So, for all periods of American history, it was possible to know that slavery was evil if you were just listening to the right people. They were there, and if you didn't hear it, that's because you refused to hear it. And so I don't worry about judging them by quote unquote modern standards because they were willfully ignoring. But for antiquity, it's harder to say that because, and this slavery as example is a good example because we don't know we don't really know the extent or arguments used against enslavement, if any in fact were made. But I still think that we can see enough. We can see from the slave revolts, for example. We can see in the case of women the voices of that are allowed to enter into history in some ways. We can see that it was possible to recognize the violence of the dominant culture. To know that it was possible to have a different orientation to politics and to the structures of power then, and to recognize that the people that the ancient thinkers who ratified and justified, like Aristotle, like any of these elite writers who justified the order of things as they saw it, were doing it in a self-interested, self-preserving way, in exclusion of critical point of views that must have existed.
Right, and I think that gets kind of to your point about, it's nothing is predestined, and like neither were the decisions that people made in the past. Like obviously, they are conditioned in ways that are vastly different from how you and I are socially conditioned, and would have had vastly different mental processes. But at the same time, the decision to uphold the structures was a decision that was made. Nothing was inevitable. Nothing was cast in stone. These were things they decided to do. And we can look at the evidence that they would have evaluated, and the way they would have formed their values are different, but it's still a decision that was made. And I also kind of just feel like there's this rhetorical trick that's played when people do that. Oh, well, you're applying modern standards to these great works. Is they want to hold up, Plato or Aristotle or Cicero as timeless exemplars of wisdom. But at the same time, well, if it's timeless, then a modern, conception of what's right and wrong should be a valid critique if it is so overarching and so foundational to the human, experience. But then so my counter would be like, well, no, these are interesting points that are being made, but you need to situate them within their time, within their space, within their context. But folks are often unwilling to do that, because then that recognizes that you do need to take the good with the bad and maybe, throw some out. But there are gems, and I think that I don't want to be like a Debbie Downer, because I do like the classical world, and I do feel like it's such an interesting dynamic place to study. But I also think that it only really becomes that way, to me at least, when applying a critical lens. I don't feel like learning about, Julius Caesar, he killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. Like, to me, history has to be more than just repeating those facts. It has to be like, well, like, who, what, when, where, and why, and and what were the attitudes surrounding these events. Otherwise, you're just kind of creating a great man mythology, whether you would like to or not.
Julius Caesar's a great example because of sort of the ethos I'm talking about right now. Kurt Raaflaub, a great historian, has an article about where he takes the modern standards, the modern international law around genocide, and he applies those standards to Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, and he concludes it meets the modern standards for genocide. There's an example of applying modern standards to the ancient world for you. But against the backdrop of that, there's a textbook for students to learn to read Caesar's Gallic Wars, which is called A Call to Conquest. And, you can just sense how the violence of that campaign is already in the title, getting sort of glorified and made attractive. I guess in the idea that like Caesar was a great military genius and a statesman,
and so that makes it okay, right? Like that's
makes it okay.
Like, yeah, exactly. And there's this feeling, I think, that can kind of exist unless you really try to like dive into the world of it's just a novel. It's just a story. Like these weren't real people. Like the million people Caesar killed in Gaul, the million he enslaved. Maybe it's an exaggeration on his own part, of course, but it's going to be a vast body count.
It's
either
a lot.
Way. Yeah. So, and you have to, I think, Dr. Robert Morstein Marx, he writes about this in his recent book, Julius Caesar and the Roman People, which I really liked. And he says, he just does a little section, just says the other side of victory. And he says, like, there's two, to have a victory, you must have a defeat. And these Gauls were real people, and to have their lives so utterly uprooted by a man who was more or less doing it for his own personal glory. There was no military threat to Rome, and even if there was, it wouldn't have justified, the extent he went to in pacifying, quote unquote, Gaul. But I don't know if you feel the same way, that I think the remove we have of 2,000 years from this time period, and the fact that the sources that do exist are often of a certain perspective, it makes the world seem artificially flat. And so it's hard for a lot of people to conceive of these things as real events as opposed to, oh, this is a morality play. Like I'm reading Plutarch for the moral lessons as if it's just a grand fable, right?
Right. And that's I mean, it's a great example of like the totally normal way to read Plutarch is for the moral lessons. You can read about that through, starting in pre-modern, early modernity. That's why Plutarch is popular as like a source of wisdom, basically moral wisdom. This is why you mentioned like the way the ancient world is sometimes viewed as being of timeless importance. I would see that claim of timelessness to be part of the claim that flattens or minimizes the human experiences totally. that are part of that, and it's all just part and parcel of the mainstream political use of Greco-Roman antiquity to make what was violent, what was exclusionary, what was destructive, even genocidal, to make that kind of palatable.
Yeah.
Caesar is acceptable because you use the term pacify, right? That'd be an old way of talking about Caesar, but it's a common way that Caesar's campaigns kind of civilized and pacified these barbarians and laid the groundwork for modern Europe, basically. Like Rome unified and civilized Europe, and that's why we have European hegemony around the globe. Of course, there's many other reasons, but that's the sort of claim, and it's a claim that is more appealing to many people to say, oh, this is because of Rome, than to say, oh, this European hegemony is because of violent colonialism in the 18th and 19th century. Yeah. European hegemony is because of the transatlantic slave trade in the 17th century and the extraction of wealth and resources and the genocide of indigenous peoples and so on and so forth. That's not an attractive narrative of why Europe dominates the world and America, the Anglo-European domination of the world right now. It's not an attractive narrative. But if we can say, oh, we locate this in classical antiquity and the unique culture of the Greeks and their love of freedom and the Roman civilizing mission across Europe, it becomes more palatable, even though it's the same thing being described.
Right. It makes it seem natural. It makes it seem inevitable, and it just there's no debate to be had. It is just how things are, and like I think the more that folks who are in powerful positions can minimize the number of debates happening, so to speak, the more that they can make things seem inevitable, the easier their job is to just kind of keep the status quo, keep things rolling. Um, so I wanted to ask that I think this book does a great job of highlighting how modern white nationalists will rely on these import values, import arguments from Greece and Rome, look to make them unimpeachable, and then kind of just say, "Well, I didn't say it; he did," and there so therefore we should enact whether it be discrimination against people of color, women, or even eugenics. But in your opinion, has this ramped up significantly? Like, I feel like I've noticed it more recently. Granted, I've only been in this space not terribly long. So, but like, I feel like there's a tendency to embrace these things as in America in particular, because we don't have maybe people from the 1400s or 1300s to valorize grand knights. Like, we're a younger country, so we have to kind of import oh, well, we're also Greeks. We're not, we're also Romans. But in your opinion, is this tendency something that's becoming more widespread, or has it always been part and parcel of like the racist political project?
Okay, two things I want to say about that. It's a great question. So I'm not a media studies specialist, but I do think that if it seems more prominent, that's partly because of the availability of the internet to propagate ideas like this to millions, even billions of people, depending on the platform and so on. So that I think it is a real change that, within the last 15 plus years, it's become easier for people to spread white nationalist ideas online, including white nationalist ideas about Greco-Roman antiquity online. And so, back when I first started on this work, the term that was in the air was the alt-right, was this movement. And I think now I don't use that term anymore. I think people working on hate and extremism don't use that term because we recognize it as a euphemism for a political movement that was really just repackaging.
Right. It was never about taxes, right? Like, they didn't care about like taxes or or trade policy or anything. It was always, like you said, neo-Confederate, neo-fascist, or some variation thereof.
But I do think that one thing that was distinctive about the alt-right was the sophistication with which they harnessed the ability of the internet to reach audiences. Like the thing I think they added to neo-fascist activism was like the translation of neo-fascist ideas to mass audiences, global mass audiences, using the online space. So I think from that point of view, we can say, yeah, we do see more of it. But one thing that's been really fascinating working on this book was, and I don't think it actually comes through in the book because it's not really what the book was about, but that there's a continuous history of neo-Nazis, neo-fascists, white nationalists, white supremacists using the ancient world to justify their politics. I have material from the 90s, from the 80s, from the 70s, going back to the Second World War. And then, of course, before then, before National Socialism and Mussolini's fascism sort of kind of pulled back the curtain on what uncritical admiration for the Roman Empire could mean. It was a completely mainstream thing to use the ancient world to justify eugenics, for example. That was a progressive idea in the earliest part of the 20th century, is eugenics. And there was a prize-winning essay written at Oxford about how, this is in the early part of the 20th century, about all the ancient sources that justify eugenic measures. That was a very of the moment progressive essay to sort of jump on eugenics with ancient material. So, I probably have to leave this to specialists in those different periods, but it is not at all new for the ancient world to be used in support of hateful ideologies, and it didn't end with the defeat of fascism in the 20th in World War II. Right away, as fascists in Europe and so on regrouped and found new approaches to promoting their politics, Greco-Roman antiquity was there just as it always had been and is all the way through. Just to give one example from this country, some people might know about William Luther Pierce, who's kind of the major white supremacist organizer in the latter part of the 20th century. He's the author of the Turner Diaries, the apocalyptic race war novel about that Timothy McVeigh had a copy of that when he was captured after the Oklahoma City bombing, and it's been linked to numerous other mass murders and terrorist attacks and things. So, he's a major influential figure in white supremacist activism in this country. And he wrote a lot about Greco-Roman antiquity. In fact, he says that, I can't remember what he said the first book he read. He had a PhD in physics and was working as a scientist. And he read something that got him, he says, thinking about race. But the second thing he said that got him thinking about race was Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he, in addition to writing this novel, this apocalyptic novel, he wrote a lot of essays about Greco-Roman antiquity. So you can just find classics there all the way through because it's so suitable for white nationalist politics. So that's one thing. But the other thing you gesture to in your question, how new is this, is you refer to the United States as a new country that doesn't have an ancient past or even medieval past to look back to. But actually, we do have an ancient or medieval past we could look back to, which is the history of the indigenous people in this country. Mm-hmm. But they weren't going to do that in the colonization of this country. And so I think we can actually see the classicism of the nation's capital and of many of our cities and universities and, just how do you recognize the sort of civic centers of many American cities as you look for the classical architecture. And I think we should see the classicism of the framers of the Constitution and of the architecture of the Capitol as a active erasure of the history that was already here and a replacement of it with a fantasy of a link to a prestigious European past, which again serves to justify the colonization and genocide of the history that was already here and the people who had lived that history. So not only is there a continuous tradition of using Greco-Roman antiquity in overtly white supremacist circles like William Luther Pierce and people like that, but I think that the mainstream history of classicism, of using the ancient world to establish an identity, a lineage or a connection to the ancient world, is pretty deeply implicated in violent and oppressive politics. And that's kind of where I'm hoping my book leads people, is that you start by thinking like, okay, this is a strange off-the-wall phenomenon of white nationalists using Greco-Roman antiquity. But by the end, I hope, people start thinking, oh gosh, like this is everywhere. It's not just on the fringe and the so-called radical right, but actually these ideas taken from antiquity, the naturalness of hierarchy, the fear of outsiders, the belief that difference causes violence, the belief that some people are just by nature superior to other people, are actually pervasive ideas in the mainstream consciousness of our country, and in many cases have been put there by appeals to the classical also.
Right. I think you're completely right. And I think that it's to kind of talk about what I had said earlier about how encouraging it is that scholarship is recognizing these trends and pushing back. And we're getting a more complex, more multifaceted view of the classical world that helps us to understand why these ideas about hierarchy, these ideas about discrimination are historically conditioned and not inevitable. They're not necessary, and societies can grow, prosper, and thrive without them. Indeed, I would say they have to. But as we kind of look at these enormous progress that scholarship is making and how I think that is reaching mass audiences, I think it's unfortunately also coming at a time when like the use of AI tools to summarize books, and folks say, well, I don't want to actually read the entire Cicero. He wrote a lot of letters. I can't read all those, ChatGPT, what is what is he talking to Atticus about all the time? And then, these algorithms will pull in information that is, inaccurate or distorted, or they'll rely on stuff that's been refuted a decade ago. And folks who are not, even folks who mean well, even folks who are not trying to undergird these outmoded ideas could end up saying, well, oh, that's what Cicero actually says, or that's, what this world was actually about. So in your view, how can people do like a diligent reading of history, in conversation with the latest trends in scholarship that pushes back on like oversimplified narratives, which unfortunately I do feel like are becoming more pervasive in an age of like mass AI and lower people just aren't reading as much?
The issue with AI, there's so many issues with AI, but I'm glad you brought that up. It's not something I've thought a ton about, but the issue with AI, I think, relevant to this is not that it necessarily would that it would distort or misrepresent anything, but that, it's gobbled up the entire internet of text, let's say, and it's using the entire internet of text to answer your question about Cicero's letters. And the vast majority, this is what I'm claiming in the book, the vast majority of the interpretations of Cicero's letters that it's going to find are ones that are endorsing the hegemonic politics of the Roman Empire, for example. And so no matter how critical we might be, it's going to be really hard just because of the way that AI functions. It's like, it's trying to produce things that are statistically likely to be the next thing you would say in this engagement.
It's not thinking, right? It's just the
data it's using is completely. I was going to say corrupted, but we can't even put it in that way. The data it's using is an artifact of this history of interpretation that we need to resist. And so it's going to reproduce and perpetuate those interpretations. Okay, so that's one thing about AI. I mean, it goes beyond what I can do with my work to make people read more, or that's a sort of daunting thing to fix. But I do think that, or what I'm hoping to prompt people to do, especially with classics, because I think it needs it more, is to develop a sort of mindset where you become suspicious, where you're able to recognize and be suspicious of the politics that are implicit in orientations to history. Yes, the best thing to do would be to read a ton of up-to-date critical scholarship and, be well-informed about what the best historians are saying about these topics right now. And I hope there will be people who do that, and you probably do that, and I try to do that. But I think as a kind of intermediate step, we can like attune ourselves to recognize that history, which we're conditioned for the reasons you say to think of as apolitical, to think of as not a political narrative, to attune ourselves to recognize the implicit politics in the ways people report history and the way that AI reports history, right? If we can become suspicious of that, then I think we can resist just sort of accepting what we are told. And then maybe that prompts you to go do, then once you become suspicious, you're more motivated to actually go see what other people are saying.
Oh, right. I totally agree. Like when I was first starting out on my journey, I did not enjoy reading like the actual primary sources nearly as much as I do now. And I think that it's now I'm no longer accepting them all at face value. I'm looking at how is the author, how does he interplay with other sources for one, but also, what is he giving preference to and what is he intentionally diminishing? And like there's a great one of the things that really was like an eye-opener for me was I think it's the life of Coriolanus in Plutarch when he's talking about the parable of the belly, where Agrippa goes before the plebs who've done a secession, and he's saying, oh, well, you just don't want to work because you don't understand. The Senate is the belly that digests the food. You're the arms that have to give us the food. And then it's treated in Plutarch as the people are rapturously held in thrall by this great man, and they agree to the demands and they end the secession. And then he later says, but then the tribunes were also established. So it's like It's like they don't like they might have humored this guy by like clapping and saying like great job, just give us tribunes and we'll be back. And he's like, okay.
But at the end of the
Yeah.
day, share political power,
Right. And
we will come back.
So it's like
Yeah.
a great illustration of the way Plutarch describes this is that it's like it's the people in their foolish decision to turn their backs on their betters. And then he even concedes that, they actually got something out of it. So they didn't actually agree with everything the guy said. But great.
Yeah,
well,
that's a good example.
And again, I just want to say for anyone who's listening that Dr. Dozier's book, The White Pedestal, I highly recommend it. And it's a great, it's great for popular audiences in the sense like you don't need to be incredibly well-versed in the classics to get a lot out of it. He does a good job of introducing ideas, where they come from, and who's exploiting them in nefarious ways. But it's also something that if you are interested in going back to read Plato for the first time in a decade, he's gonna help you develop that critical eye that I think will help you get a lot more out of it, and you'll understand the historical conditions that might have contributed to it. So, Dr. Dozier, again, thank you for the book. Like I said, not just a great read, but one that was important and one that I feel like really rises to the moment. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. And yeah, if any of your listeners or viewers are interested in the book, you can find it, wherever books are sold. But we got a promo code. I'm not sure how long it'll last, but it's going strong. We got a promo code if you order directly from Yale. The promo code is WIN26. It gets you 30% off. I hope you'll take a look if this is an idea that's interesting to you.
Absolutely. And so I'll include links below to the book as well as to Pharos. And then are there any other projects you're working on? Any social media you'd like to plug?
Yeah, you can follow me on Blue Sky, curtisdozier.bsky.social. That's where I post most of what I have coming out or what I'm thinking about. I'm the website Pharos, I launched that in 2017. I haven't been as active on there recently because I've been working on this book and promoting this book and everything. But I've got to, believe me, in 2026, I've got a long backlog of things I'd like to write on there. So take a look at that site. There's a way at the bottom of any of the articles on Pharos, you can throw your email in a box and get an email whenever I publish something new there. There's not a lot of spam there. It's just when I publish something new. So I'm hoping to get back to that. I'll just for your viewers who are interested in scholarship that's coming up, I'll call attention to there's a new Cambridge companion to classics and race, which is going to come out a little later this year in 2026. I have a little article on it in it on white nationalist classicism that is a kind of preview of my book. But I want to call attention to this volume in particular because this book is really challenging the idea that because the ancient world did not employ the same logics of race that modern white supremacy employs, there's a kind of orthodoxy that because the ancient world didn't employ the same racial logics as the modern world, that means there was no race in antiquity. And some people even take that to mean there was no racism in antiquity. And this book is really challenging and I think demolishing that orthodoxy, that's showing that not only that this idea that the ancient world was innocent of race and racism has impoverished our understanding of the ancient world, but that the category of race understood as a set of essentializing attitudes connected to political power, whether it is connected to modern racist pseudoscience or depends on other factors as it did in the ancient world, is a very productive way to think about the ancient world. So I'm really excited to see that come out very soon. And that's, there's probably 20 top-notch scholars, historians of race in pre-modernity who are contributing to that. So I recommend it.
Excellent. And that sounds super fascinating. I can't wait to dig into that personally. And
I should have said it's edited by Jackie Murray, Elena Giusti, and Rosa Andujar. So look for that from Cambridge soon in 2026, I would say.
At Tribunate, we are the YouTube channel that gives people homework, and I'm proud to
Okay,
do
that's your
that.
homework.
So, all right. Well, Dr. Dozier, I really appreciate your time, and again, appreciate the book. Encourage everyone to read it. But until next time, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on. It was a great conversation.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.